The New Orleans Saints' decision to retain Derek Carr as their starting quarterback in 2025 indicates a strong will to compete, even though many think they shouldn't. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints defense is going to change, but do expect those changes to be gradual. Taysom Hill's future sounds like it's still in New Orleans, and the New Orleans Saints have made it clear that they're riding with Derek Carr as their starter in 2025. We appreciate you very much as always, whether it's your first time or your next time being with us this time, making us your first listen and being it every day. You're here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The New Orleans Saints have made it abundantly clear by indicating, at least, that Derek Carr will be the starting quarterback in 2025. I was amongst the small group of local reporters here in Indianapolis. They were able to meet with general manager Mickey Loomis, head of college personnel, scouting assistant general manager in Jeff Ireland, as well as new head coach Kellen Moore to do press conference kind of media availability. Was probably more appropriate to say than press conference. To be able to chat with them and kind of figure out and get some intel on where things are going for this New Orleans Saints team. And one of the biggest questions that we knew needed to be answered during this combine week was about whether or not the New Orleans Saints were going to retain Derek Carr as their starting quarterback. And by all indications, that looks to be the case. General manager Mickey Loomis saying that they feel like they have a guy that they can win with, and that guy being Derek Carr. We did clarify that after the fact to make sure he was talking about Derek Carr. And then Kellen Moore also talking about how they're, excited to have him and they're happy to have him and all these other things kinds of terms of moving forward. So I would expect Derek Carr to be the week one starter for the New Orleans Saints in 2025 and to be the expected starter throughout the 2025 season. This means to me three things. Number one, it means that the New Orleans Saints are likely to work on his contract in order to be able to free up some money and be able to spend here in free agency. Number two, it means that there's an investment that the investment in young quarterbacks in this year's draft probably doesn't make as much sense. And instead, just being able to focus on developing Spencer Rattler behind Derek Carr kind of makes the most sense. And then if you want to go back to the quarterback market, you can in 2026. And then three, the Saints intend to compete in 2025, even when many believe that they shouldn't. I still can't say that this team is going to win more than 7 games in 2025. It's got nothing to do with who the quarterback is or isn't. It's a new offensive system. It's a new defensive system. It's a new head coach. It's a new offense. It's a new defensive coordinator. All of these changes have been underway. And so with that, it's really challenging to walk out and say that the exact same roster with all new coaches is going to perform better, much better in 2025. It's really challenging to say that. And I feel like I would be lying to you if I said, oh yeah, no, I think this can be a playoff team right now. We have to see what they add in free agency, what they add in the draft, all these other things. Because if they're intending to compete, they're going to have to add talent. They need that big-bodied receiver. They need the speed rushers off the edge, especially with the new defensive system. They're going to need to address the safety position. They're going to need to address the tight end position. They're going to need to address their offensive line and their defensive line. There's a lot to add to this team. Just about every position could use some type of attention. The other thing on top of all that is that after you do all that, you have to be able to stay healthy, which this organization has not proven they've been able to do over the course of the past few years. We talk about it like it was an issue just in 2025, but it's been an issue since about 2020, 2021. So with all of that in consideration, I can't sit here today without knowing what the Saints are going to do moving forward in terms of additions to the team. Understand that they're going to be a better team in 2025. And so some teams will willingly say, we're going to take a step back in order to take a step forward. The New Orleans Saints are not that team. The New Orleans Saints are operating under every indication that they intend to compete. And now what's being said to us and what's being said behind closed doors might be different, But I like the thing that Kellen Moore said when he said, you can't ever walk into a locker room and say that we're not competing. I think there's truth to that. How are you going to truly rectify the idea of walking into the locker room, looking at Cameron Jordan, looking at DeMario Davis, looking at Tyron Mathieu and saying, you know what, guys, we're going to kind of take a back seat this year. We're not going to push. We're not going to compete, blah, 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 blah. Those guys aren't going to like that. And I get that. But I also understand the idea of take the medicine and then go out there and compete, right? Have a tough present so that you have a better future. I could see the argument going either way. But I think that that's what this indicates. Even though many people believe that they should not compete, the New Orleans Saints are intent upon competing. And I think that keeping Derek Carr in the building tells you that. I think the other thing that this, going back to the restructure situation, is that restructuring the contract is going to be a must, or doing something with Derek Carr's contract is going to be a must. $51 million cap hit, $30 million becomes guaranteed on the third day of the league year, which is March 14th. We are less than 2 weeks away from free agency in the NFL. And so here's how some of the contract stuff works. If the Saints restructure, do a full, simple restructure on Derek Carr's contract, they save $31 million immediately. That then doesn't really put too much of a strain on their future. I've heard a lot of people, or seen a lot of people talking about, well, if the Saints restructure Derek Carr now, then they're committed to him for the next couple of years. False. Absolutely incorrect. The Saints could easily restructure him now, and then in 2026, if they decide that they want to move on at that point, designate him as a post-June 1 hit. You're taking a $19 million hit when you do that in terms of spreading out some of the dead cap, $40 million a year after that. That sounds like a lot, but remember the salary cap is expected to be over $310 million by the time of that $40 million dead cap hit happens in 2027. And we're watching teams across the NFL being more and more willing to do this. They're taking $80, $90 million cap hits on guys in some cases, right? 70, 80 probably is more accurate. You're looking across the NFL right now, guys like Myles Garrett, guys like Matthew Stafford, guys that are all kind of getting these trade requests. Teams are willing to push things down the road if they decide to move on from them in a non-trade transaction. They're willing to move on from them and take that cap hit because of this ever rising and not at all slowing down salary cap that's going on in the NFL right now. So I think the New Orleans Saints would just be a part of that number and have no problem with that. So no, restructuring Derek Carr in 2025 does not make you married to him in 2026. We've said that a bunch, but there's some figures and things like that that kind of help to lay all that out. I think Ross, have advocated for the Saints and Derek Carr splitting, right? Makes more sense for Derek Carr to go somewhere where they're not in the midst of a rebuild. I'm saying rebuild because the Saints have a new head coach. Anytime that you're replacing a head coach, anytime that you're replacing a quarterback, you're in the midst of a rebuild. That's my opinion. That's not the way that every NFL team looks at it, though. The Saints don't look at themselves as being a reset team. They look at themselves as adding talent and going out there and trying to compete again. Respect. Fine. Nothing but respect for that. But I look at them as being in a different place, and that's just me. And so my advocation for moving on from Derek Carr was let him go and do something else. You focus on your future, right? Because Derek Carr's probably your quarterback for another year. He's not your quarterback of the future. And so focus on the guys that could become your quarterback of the future, or invest in a guy that could become your quarterback of the future. Sounds like the Saints, if they do want to go that route, won't do so until 2026. But we always knew that Derek Carr returning as the starting quarterback in 2025 was likely the path for the Saints, right? Likely the path that they wanted to go. Turns out that's exactly right. So we'll see where things go. Maybe Kellen Moore works magic and Derek Carr fits great in his system. We don't know yet, but we'll see where things go. And then we'll see what the future looks like beyond that. But for 2025, at least for right now, and at least for week 1, expect Derek Carr to be the New Orleans Saints starting quarterback. Coming up next, another big name whose future with the New Orleans Saints was in question. Sounds like he's solidified in New Orleans. There's only 2 big questions surrounding him, and that is Taysom Hill. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, family, if there's anyone you should be excited to see in Kellen Moore's offense, it's probably do-it-all tight end Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill's future sounds like it's in New Orleans. The Saints want him. It sounds like he wants to be in New Orleans as well. There's just 2 big question marks that kind of circle his future, right? That could decide his future. The number one thing is going to be his return from injury. The number two thing is, what do you do with his contract? There was all this talk about Taysom Hill potentially going to Denver and the Saints looking at trading him or being interested in trading him and maybe cutting him and designating him post June 1 and all the other stuff. And every single one of those stories was speculation. Every single one of them was the Saints could do this. The Broncos could do this. This might happen. This would make sense. Those types of things. Those are speculative stories. Those are not things that are being reported as fact or as would happen or anything like that. It was compounded, of course, by Sean Payton over in Denver saying that he wants a joker. And he's had jokers before. Taysom Hill, Alvin Kamara, Jimmy Graham, all were kind of different versions of a joker role in that they can move around and be utilized from a bunch of different places. And so Taysom Hill became this big conversation around the possibility for Denver, but it never really felt like that's the way that things were going. And we got some confirmation on that here in Indianapolis when the Saints effectively said, look, we want Taysom Hill to be a part of what it is they're doing. I'm paraphrasing, but they basically said that they want Taysom Hill to be a part of what it is they're doing. It sounds like he's a part of their future. The only big question mark is when is he able to return, or the only two big question marks, when is he able to return to the field? What do you do with the contract? So I want to break down each of those questions. What do you do, or when does he return to the field is going to be a big one, right? Because really the biggest thing is not, do the Saints want him? Does he want to be with the New Orleans Saints? It's simply, when can he be back out on the field? It's not a question of interest. It's a question of time. That's the only thing that stands in the way between Taysom Hill taking the field in 2025 in a New Orleans Saints uniform is time. He's coming off of that ACL injury, which required surgery to repair. I've heard in some cases that he had additional knee damage. I've heard in other cases that he might not have had additional knee damage. I've heard more that he's had additional knee damage in addition to just the ACL tear. We'll see. I'm sure we'll learn more at a later time. But with that being the case, a 9 to 12 month recovery period from a December injury puts you back on the field at the earliest in October? And it was mid-December. And so mid-October is the earliest part that you're looking at. And so is that okay? Is that going to work? Is that really the timeline? Is he going to be able to get back sooner? Is it going to take him longer? Is he in the early portion of that 9 to 12 month timeline, or is he in the late portion of that 9 to 12 month timeline? And I would say probably in today's NFL, it's more like 8 to 12 months. That's probably more accurate. But with additional knee damage, if there is any, then that's the thing that maybe pushes that timeline a little bit further. So that's got to be the number one question. Not is he going to be around, not will he be a New Orleans Saint, but when will he be back with the New Orleans Saints? That's going to be the biggest thing. So it sounds like everything's positive that we're hearing in terms of the injury recovery, surgery. Got the 2 thumbs up from Darren Rizzi on that. It sounds like the recovery is going well. Also that he's in good spirits. He and Kellen Moore have talked and everything. So it's clear that there's some progress and some promise in the midst of all that. The big question is just going to be, when will he actually be back out on the field? So that's something we'll continue to track throughout the offseason. The other question mark was, what do you do with the contract? $10 million in terms of base salary. $11 million could have been saved if they designated him as a post-June 1 cut, which never really felt like a real thing that they were going to do. And so with that, you have to probably look at the idea of adjusting the contract. And there's many ways to do that. The Saints have shown over the course of the past few years that they're not just limiting themselves to restructures anymore. They're doing these interesting things. They're going to people for pay cuts. In other cases, they're guaranteeing people more long-term guarantees in exchange for taking less money now. I don't know if you can do that with a 34-year-old Taysom Hill coming off of a major knee injury and say, oh, yeah, well, we'll give you some guarantees in 2026 if you take less money in 2025. I guess you could do that, but it doesn't seem like that should necessarily be the way that they go. We'll see which way they go, but expect his contract number to be impacted in some way. Those conversations are going to happen. And I think that you're going to see some resolution between the team and the player that results in them saving some money on his contract in some way. The only thing that I could see going sideways in terms of his return to the field for New Orleans, and there's not really any limitations, by the way, even though he's coming off of injury, even though he's on injured reserve, basically any of the mechanisms that they could have used for a healthy Taysom Hill, they can use for recovering Taysom Hill, is my understanding. So they should be able to have any mechanism available that they want to be able to get this done. But the only thing I could see maybe throwing a wrench in things is if the Saints say, we need you to take a pay cut, and he won't take a pay cut. And the Saints are unwilling to restructure his deal or unwilling to give him future guarantees in addition to taking. Then I could see maybe a rift being made at that point, and then all of a sudden things go off. But I don't think that that's going to happen. Taysom Hill wants to be in New Orleans from the sound of it. And I think Taysom Hill probably would love to be a part of Kellen Moore's offense in particular. I think Kellen Moore's offense and the versatility, the way that they game plan, the way that they lean on mismatch football and mismatch game planning, that Taysom Hill's a perfect fit for what it is that Kellen Moore wants to achieve and wants to do over on the offensive side. And so I think with all of that context, it seems unlikely that there would be any kind of risk or any kind of rift that would be created, because it sounds like both of these sides of this conversation want Taysom Hill back on the field for the New Orleans Saints and in a New Orleans Saints uniform. So that's the way that I kind of see all this playing out. I think you'll see some type of contract adjustment made, but otherwise Taysom will be in this Kellen Moore offense. What does the Kellen Moore offense actually provide to Taysom Hill? It's kind of more really, what does Taysom Hill provide to the Kellen Moore offense, right? Because Kellen Moore does a really good job of just leaning into what it is that players already do well. And the answer for that when it comes to Taysom Hill is simply yes, right? This is a New Orleans Saints team that is going to be predicated by its run game big time, but a more diverse run game than what you saw last year under Clint Kubiak, which had one punch. This New Orleans Saints offense with Kellen Moore, inside runs, outside runs, zone runs, man runs, different schemes, gap schemes, all this other stuff. It'll be a very versatile offense in that way. And Taysom Hill becomes a part of the way that you're able to maximize that. Him as a QB power quarterback, but also him as a QB sweep quarterback, and the ability to be able to run out a wildcat, but also the ability to be able to run out of the backfield, the ability to be able to block as a fullback, the ability to be able to take snaps at tight end, all those other things, which is a position I expect the Saints, by the way, to be very, very busy with this offseason, is tight end. I think you're looking at Taysom Hill being a really good chess piece for a Kellen Moore. So it's less about what Kellen Moore has done with other players and more about what Taysom Hill gives Kellen Moore the opportunity to do. Think about what Kellen Moore tried to do with Austin Eckler, what Kellen Moore did do with Tony Pollard. These are the types of like versatile running backs out of the backfield that could also catch and all these other things that you can kind of see game plans replicated, bits of the game plan replicated around Taysom Hill. But then you add the quarterback element and the tight end element, and then all of a sudden he's right back to being that Swiss Army knife. It'll be interesting to see if maybe Kellen Moore focuses him down a little bit more. But outside of that, I think Taysom Hill gives Kellen Moore every opportunity to be able to focus him down in the run game in one game, but then the passing game in another game, and be able to kind of just utilize that versatility to be able to bank on the biggest mismatches. Taysom Hill returning from injury, Foster Moreau returning from injury. You also have Juwan Johnson as a free agent. You've got young guys in Dallin Holker and Trayton Welsh, as well as Michael Jacobson. But I expect the Saints to pay a lot of attention to tight end in this year's offseason, whether that's returning Juwan Johnson and adding a new face or adding multiple new faces. Expect that to be a position where the Saints are particularly busy, especially with all of the injuries at that position as well. But expect Taysom Hill to be back in New Orleans, at least for now, and expect him to be a major chess piece for Kellen Moore once he's healthy and able to get back out on the field. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints are going to be making some defensive changes, but they might be a little bit more gradual. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints are indeed changing their defensive scheme under new defensive coordinator Brandon Staley. However, don't expect it to be a full launch in 2025. Instead, expect some gradual movements towards that 3-4 defense over the course of the next couple of years. And really, it's not necessarily a gradual move towards a 3-4 defense, just more and more being added. I think you'll see more of that 3-man front in week 18 than you'll see in week 1 in 2025. But I want to explain why. We knew that this was going to be a big possibility for New Orleans. A lot of the guys that they considered for defensive coordinator are all guys that had backgrounds in sort of that odd front 3-4 defense. But as we discussed in a show earlier this week, being a 3-4 defense or having 3-4-ness in your defense is really about just utilizing it more than an average team, right? It's kind of like when we talked about zone run and being a zone run offense and stuff like that. Well, typically your zone run offense is Clint Kubiak excluded. But typically a zone run offense just means that you run zone slightly more than you run man and gap schemes. It's usually still a blend or a balance. I think you would expect to see the same thing for New Orleans in 2025 when it comes to adding sort of the 3-4 positioning. One of the things that Kellen Moore said to us on Wednesday was, I think at the end of the day, you're going to win the game and lose the game in nickel, 4-2-5. Now, your other moves whether they be 3-4 or 4-3, there's certainly flexibility within that. So I think what you're hearing here is that there is absolutely going to be more 3-4 looking fronts, but that you're still going to see this team go out there and play nickel in a 4-2-5 set. Now, here's the thing about the 4-2-5 set. So when we talk about 4-2-5, we mean 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, 5 defensive backs. That's your typical nickel defense across the NFL. But that 4-2-5 could easily be a 3-3-5, 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, and then 5 defenders. To me, the thing that's going to be most interesting is when they do go to the 4-2-5 and they do go to their nickel look and they have 4 down linemen, is one of them still a stand-up pass rusher? Is one of them still a stand-up pass rusher, speed rusher prototype? Because as long as they're adding that to the defense, which does sound like something they're going to be adding, it was Jeff Ireland who said to us, we're looking at different, and he was talking about prototypes for ends, different nose tackles, different linebackers. So that's where the prototypes change, is basically what he was highlighting. I'm adding some context in between the exact quote there to make sure that nothing gets misconstrued. But with that, you're going to still expect to see the stand-up pass rusher. So even in a 4-2-5, it doesn't exclude you from being able to utilize speed rushers as a part of your game plan and your attack. You don't have to exclusively be a 3-4 team in order to have and utilize that mold of a pass rusher. It's just, does your defense have a role for that mold of prototype, for that mold of pass rusher? And the Saints in the past have not had a role for that mold. They have relied on the big-bodied, 6'4" and above, 270 and above pound, 260 and above pound pass rushers that put their hand in the dirt, that convert speed to power, and that oftentimes have to win on a second or third effort because the coverage is holding up, right? That's usually the game plan for the Saints. Set the edge first, be a run defender, be an edge defender as opposed to an edge rusher. Now, all of a sudden, this new role allows the Saints to have the opportunity to utilize more prototypes. So it adds more players to the board for them to be able to invest in the draft, in free agency, all those other things. So I would expect to see the Saints still running a lot of 4 down lineman looks while incorporating more nose tackle, stand-up speed rushers, 3-man looks, stuff like that, while also still sticking with the NFL's bread and butter of a nickel defense. And I think that's where you start to talk about things like the star role being a part of their experience, where that star role or that star corner is that nickel corner who serves as that hybrid downhill safety coverage corner, slot corner, all that kind of stuff. And so is a chess piece that can move around quite a bit over on that defensive side. So I think you're still going to see a lot of 4-2-5. You're still going to see a lot of nickel. There was never going to be any change in that. We kind of knew that anyway. But to expect the roles and the molds for pass rushers and the roles and molds for defensive tackles, and to an extent, the roles and molds for linebackers, right, to change, because typically those stand-up speed rushers are outside linebackers. So you're looking at the role of an inside linebacker, which is all the Saints used to look for, where those inside coverage linebackers may be the Sam versatile guy that can be on the strong side for 4-3 base downs and stuff like that, which they didn't play a ton of. Now you have 2 different positions effectively, right? I'm simplifying, but 2 different positions or roles that you're building out when it comes to your linebackers, the inside linebackers and the outside linebackers. And those outside linebackers are usually the pass rushers. Just to give you some names, and we'll be doing this here throughout other shows as well, to highlight some of the folks that fit that new role. Carl Granderson could be one of those guys, 6'4", played around 270 this past season, I believe, and came into the NFL at 254. So his ability to probably be able to slim down and be a stand-up speed rusher would probably put him right back to the progress and but to the production that he had as a speed rusher in Wyoming. Isaiah Foskey, a guy whose name everybody kind of scoffs at, but fits the mold. The right height, the right weight, the right speed, the right athleticism, and experience in that Viper role with the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, where he had 22 sacks and over 30 tackles for a loss in his final 2 seasons when that role was a little bit more introduced to him. Via free agency, you've got guys like Hassan Reddick, Joshua Uche, Baron Browning, Aziz Ojolari. There's always the Khalil Mack, 6'3", 269 pounds. I don't expect to see that happen, but there is the connection between Brandon Staley and Khalil Mack being in Chicago together, being in Los Angeles together. But I think you're trying to make this roster younger. And so you can't do that while also signing aging players like that. So even if you got him on a 1-year deal like you did with Chase Young, okay, sure, right? It's good mentorship to have and everything like that. But I don't know if that's the Saints' MO, I think is the biggest thing. And then now you add into the fact that they just hired Bo Davis of LSU as their defensive line coach. And I'm not just saying this because he was the LSU defensive line coach and he was an LSU Tiger, but he's one of the better defensive line coaches in every level of the game. Every level of the game. Highly respected. And so the Saints get a huge hire in Bo Davis. And so now you get even more excited about what these defensive linemen can be. And Bo Davis has a big time background with Nick Saban. Of course, was coached by Nick Saban, worked with Nick Saban in Miami, worked with Nick Saban in Alabama. And so his experience with Saban and that Ripley's defense, pattern matching, all that kind of stuff, that matches really well the Brandon Staley, Vic Fangio style defense that he runs. Anyway, that's a big addition. And then some draft prospects that make sense as well. James Pierce Jr. out of Tennessee, who we talked about a bunch. Jalen Walker of Georgia. Princely Uman-Mielen out of Ole Miss. Donovan Eziraku out of Boston College. Oluwafemi Oladejo out of UCLA. David Walker out of Central Arkansas. There's so many. Mike Green out of Marshall. Like, there's so many of these players in this year's draft. So it's really the perfect time to start to institute this new role, because so many of the people that prototypically fit that new role are fantastic additions in this year's draft and part of the strongest position group in this year's selection process. So Saints will have a lot of opportunity to continue to add in those defensive changes, but expect it to take place gradually and not be just a full kind of score go into a 3-4 defense. And that's all you ever see them in. I don't think you're going to see that. All right. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, salary cap. Let's dive in with restructures. We'll look at restructures. We'll look at contract stuff, and we'll look at how much money the New Orleans Saints are actually able to spend or make so that they can spend. Because the answer, especially if they're keeping Derek Carr, is surprisingly a lot. We'll dive into all that in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much. As always, make it your first listen. Go and check out Locked On NFL Draft. You won't want to miss any episodes of Locked On NFL Draft. Damian and Keith doing a fantastic job over there, keeping up to date with everything around the combines. Make sure you go and check them out as well, wherever you get your podcast. We appreciate you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me in the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else or on your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation, I'll holla at you.